Today is my deep dive into the Z6III. We're going to compare it a bit to the Zf, kind of the last generation of the Z6 original sensor. We're going to do some pixel peeping. We're going to look at dynamic range. We're going to look at low light performance. Strap in, it's going to be fun. Well, hey everybody, welcome to this week's video. I'm here on Mount St. Helens gearing up to do a little Milky Way work. I'm going to work with both the Zf and the Z6III, two cameras I've been excited to test drive doing star photography. I'm here at Mount St. Helens, a really beautiful place, big high pressure cell, no clouds to be seen. I've been shooting a ton, people, high dynamic range type scenes. I've been researching what the gurus at Photons to Photos have to say about these two sensors, and I've got a lot of images to run through, kind of comparing performance, both dynamic range and low light noise images. And we'll kind of run through what this new Z6III's partially stacked sensor is capable of and how it compares to the latest iteration of that original 24 megapixel sensor, the backlit sensor that's been in the Z6, the Z6II, the Zf. It's a venerable low light powerhouse that I just love. And we'll kind of talk about what my choice is for which cameras I'm keeping and what I think of both cameras. So stay tuned. We'll jump in and we'll do some deep dive looking into the actual image quality. All right, well, I promised you we're going to look at images both from the Z6III and the Zf. We're going to compare noise, we're going to compare dynamic range a little bit, but I want to look at a couple of important charts first. And this website, Photons to Photos, you can go to photonstophotos.net, has tons of information about just about every camera out there. It's an MIT scientist who does tons of tests, has tons of charts, and the most important ones that I look at are the photographic dynamic range versus ISO setting, and the read noise and dynamic numbers versus ISO setting. All right, so we're going to look right now at dynamic range, and we're looking at the Zf in blue, or the Z6III in blue, and we're looking at the Zf in green, and the higher the number, the more dynamic range. And you can see there's two channels of the way that they amplify the signal. The amount of light coming into the sensor is finite. It's always the same at a given exposure setting, but the way that we amplify that signal is what really ISO is doing. And you can see that they have two different ways of accomplishing that. That's why I talk about a second base ISO channel in these cameras at 800. They change the way that they amplify that signal as you turn the ISO up. In the early lower numbers of ISO where there's plenty of light, they're trying to maximize dynamic range. At 800 and beyond, they're really working to reduce noise at the expense of dynamic range. So you see that kick right there at 800, all right? And you can see that right up until about 10,000 ISO, maybe even a little higher, that the Zf is doing just a little better than the Z6III. And that's something that's not unexpected when you have a stacked sensor. That sensor is built for speed. It's built to read really quickly. It's built for video. It's built for insanely fast frame rates, insanely fast processing of those autofocus determinant points. So, you sacrifice a little bit in dynamic range. It's not massive. It looks like, a little more than a half a stop. Not insignificant, it's a little less than 10%. But it gets really close once you get into that upper area where it starts working with noise, all right? Let's take a look at noise between the two cameras. And in this case, the Z6III is the blue, the Zf is the black, and the lower the number, the less noise there is, all right? And you can see, these are these simulated exposure settings below 100 ISO, that low 1, low 2, low 3. Same thing up here beyond 51,200. And you can read about this triangle up and down. It indicates scaling and noise reduction and a whole bunch of different analog versus digital signal processing. But you can see that ramp up rather quickly in noise up to just below 800 ISO. And that at 800 ISO, the way they process that signal is significantly geared towards reducing noise. In fact, the noise from your Zf is about the same at 200 ISO as it is at 800 ISO. That's why I say 800 ISO is your Milky Way setting. And that's about the same in the Z6III, all right? The Z6III, we're looking at about, somewhere between 100 and 200 ISOs performance at 800. But across the board, The ZF is doing a little bit better in noise, although it kicks over beyond 12,800 to doing some noise reduction. And we'll actually see that in the images, whereas it's still analog signal processing and then digital signal processing, and they don't really get into doing any noise reduction until way up there on the Z6III. It's just a different way of handling the processing that they've kind of juiced the sauce in the new stacked sensor. But you can see that there's not a huge difference in scientific measurements between these two cameras, except that the Z6III has a little bit better noise performance, the ZF, the original Z6 sensor, the 24 megapixel sensor, has a little bit better noise and very, very similar dynamic range, a little less in those critical early ISO numbers. All right, so let's take a look at images and see what all of that means. And I'm going to just zoom in to 100%. Well, I'm going to zoom into full screen here, and you can see what image right away. Down here, you can see where there's red. Red is Z6III. Also up here in my file naming, it's going to say what it is and exposure settings here. And you can see, I mean, there is just nothing wrong with the images pretty much straight out of the camera with the Z6III. They're beautiful. Its autofocus is snappy. It's fast as can be. There's plenty of resolution for me here on my 4K monitor, and you can always run in and use Lightroom's Enhance and Super Resolution to bump these sharp files like this from 24 megapixels to 96 without much loss in image quality. I mean, really imperceptible just to get bigger prints. You can see that down near its base ISO, it's handling specular highlights quite nicely. I did some work in more contrasty conditions, longer lens work, higher ISO, sometimes shooting wildlife and pets, and so bouncing back and forth at higher shutter speeds. This was out at my aunt's house on the Sandy River here in Oregon. Beautiful day. We had a bunch of family in town, playing around with the kids. We got in wetsuits. We played in the river. And, you know, I think you can see pretty beautiful images out of the Z6III. We're still just in Z6III land. Animal eye detect working obviously great with pets. I did some sports action work with my kite surfing friends and hydrofoiling friends on the Columbia River, just a little bit north of Portland on the way to the coast. And this is my friend Eric out hydrofoiling. Really harsh contrasty conditions. Difficult, you know, to focus far out on a small subject like that. Camera nailed it. I used 3D tracking on Eric's body, nailed him. Tracking my friend Cristiano, doing tricks on his kiteboard, beautiful. Just, you know, looks phenomenal. I will note that up at 320 ISO, I wasn't able to pull any highlight detail back in this little cruiser that was heading by on the river. You know, not a big deal. It's a white boat. You could certainly recover it, print it fine. You can get rid of it with distraction removal in Photoshop. I did a little bit of bird work on the Sandy River. You know, there were these there were these birds in the trees around my aunt's house, and throwing animal eye detect, 3D tracking, boom, wide area tracking, boom, nailed these birds. And in flight, you know, this is a very small bird. I didn't do any cropping, I don't think, on this image. Nope, it's the full raw file. But you can see it tracked the bird just fine in flight, moving through the scene, even though it was tiny in wide area with animal detect. Not a simple shot. These are erratic, small, fast-moving birds. And at 2000 ISO, it's handling specular highlights pretty well. So all this talk about dynamic range, not such a big deal. It handled manually focusing my favorite 51.0 Voigtlander lens really well. You know, here's Pike having a snack at a coffee shop downtown in Portland. You know, I was shooting birds in flight, faster shutter speed. Actually, no, I'm at 250th of a second here, 560 ISO. I was thinking of another image. And, you know, we're starting to blow some highlights out a little bit in this image. It's not terrible, though. I'll bet that's recoverable. Maybe the top of Pike's head is a little rough, but beautiful image, and I have no problem with there being specular highlights and scenes. This one is way up at 2500 ISO because I was shooting those birds flying through the scene, and then my cousin Gabby sneaked up and you know, I played around with this and there was no real way to recover the highlights in her hair. But again, we're at 2500 ISO. We're up in that noise reduction ISO setting, not in the high quality dynamic range landscape type settings. I do feel that the ZF just does a beautiful job with highlights and shadows and exposure and its matrix metering. You know, this is in a swimming pool that we rented with the family while I had a bunch of family in town and just playing around. We got some of the kids' friends from school, and we have my cousin Gabby with her little boy Leon. He's like my little nephew. He's actually at the house right now with my aunt taking care of him. One of Pike's best friends, Paul, playing around in the pool, Leon. You know, I feel like the highlight rendering and the way that the ZF handles harsh contrasty scenes is just beautiful. But sometimes I think there are things that a non-stacked sensor are a little bit better for, and a stacked sensor is a little better for that speed, action, video stuff. All right, so now we're going to get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty. This is some noise comparisons. All right, we're going to look at some noise comparisons and then some Milky Way comparisons. Actually, before I do that, I will speak to something where I just think that the Z6III has it in spades over the ZF, and that's the video modes. The video is just spectacular. I shot all of ATS 311. You can click right here and see that video, what I looked like talking in it. It was just sort of beautiful shooting an ATS video on the 6III here in my studio. That's the one where I did the portrait work. And also, down on the river, you know, I shot some scenes with the family, and the image stabilization, that 8 stops of image stabilization that you have with the ZF and the Z6III only is just amazing hand-holding with a longer lens. But the thing that the Z6III has over the ZF is the ability to do 240 frames a second in 1080p and 120 frames per second in 4K 10-bit video internally to the card. That's kind of amazing. I can do that 120 frames per second 10-bit on the Z9. You can do it on the Z8. But you can't do the 240 frames per second at 1080p. And I'll show you, it just lets you do fun stuff like this shot of my aunt's dog Ollie shaking all the water off of his fur as he comes out of the river chasing balls for us. And for glorious 10-bit high bitrate 4K. The Z6III is a magnificent, magnificent video camera. All right, so let's look at noise. We're back here. Taking a look at some shots I did at Pike and Pepper in the studio. I lit them, but left a lot of shadows in the background. I didn't turn on some of the backlights. I've got them lit with soft boxes to be really nicely lit, and then shadows falling off in the background. And I have these coded. Again, the Z6III images are red, the ZF images are not color coded. And we're gonna hit the compare view here. And you can also see up here, ZF versus Z6III. The ZF is in the Z6III shots, the Z6III is in the ZF shots. So, you know, zooming in, this is at base ISO, 100 ISO. Not surprisingly, both of them look beautiful throughout the frame. Gorgeous, wonderful, wonderful rendering, okay? Let's take a look at 800 ISO, that's that second channel. We know noise is gonna be good, you know, all the way through 800 ISO, that's our second base channel. That's where we would work with Milky Way scenes. And again, you know, maybe there's a tiny bit less noise visible in the ZF, but it's really pretty insignificant. I mean, let's get real. They both look great. You can read Nikon really clearly in both of them. Maybe you can read the 14 to 24's lettering a little bit better on the ZF. It's so close, why would we quibble, all right? So we're gonna ratchet it up to 6400 ISO, bouncing up three stops. And you can see these cameras are so usable in low light. Way less noise than I get out of my Z9, way less noise than you're gonna get out of a Z8. This is without any noise reduction. This is just straight out of camera, guys. Pretty darned incredible at 6400 ISO. All right, let's take it up another notch. And in this case, we're actually gonna look at the straight out of camera 12,800 ISO images, okay? Still really, really good. I mean, maybe there's a little bit more noise in the Z6III, but it's not very noticeable, not really. Pretty fantastic, both of them, just pretty fantastic. It's a whole new world when we can shoot at 12,800 ISO and not even really worry about noise reduction. If I run it through Lightroom's Enhance with the denoise, Lightroom's built-in denoise, look at it. That's crazy. We're at 12,800. These 24 megapixel sensors from Nikon are just money in low light. And then you combine that with the 8 stops of in-body image stabilization, and it becomes hand-holdable in the lowest of light situations. It's just nuts. The only thing you have to worry about is whether your subject is moving. Okay, so let's take a look. Let's ratchet it up a bit. I'm going to go to the non-enhanced 25,600 ISO images, and this is where we noticed that the Z6III was doing some analog signal processing as compared to noise reduction in the Z6 and the photons to photo test. They both look great. You know, maybe there's a little loss of detail in the Z6 or in the Zf because it is doing that noise reduction on the raw files, but you know, I can sort of see it in the lens markers on the Leica back here, and maybe a little bit on the 400 on the Z9 in the back, but they both look wonderful. They're both usable. 25,600. You know, I don't know that I'd print them huge, but wow, I mean, that's just crazy. Run them through Lightroom's Enhance with denoise. Again, it's just astounding. Not a whole big difference. Wow. Just cray-cray. It's just wonderful. And then finally, let's go up to their maximum actual ISO numbers on the camera. And this is where things start to get mushy. This is where I would only use this camera in an emergency at this level of ISO, 51,200 ISO. And what you start to see these little striations. You're seeing some of the underlying sensor architecture getting amplified. The actual rows of pixels, or the columns of pixels, kind of showing some lines in there. Color noise here. Both sensors are doing that to a certain extent. I wouldn't grade one much better than the other. You know, maybe the Z6III is pulling just a little bit ahead way up here, but let's run them both through denoise. You know, and if you're not seeing some of the stuff that I'm talking about, make sure that you're looking at this in 4K. You should definitely, as I put the note up at the beginning of this video, watch this in 4K, because that's how you're gonna see these pixels. This is how I'm shooting it. This is how I'm putting it up on YouTube. If YouTube's serving it out to you, it's lower resolution. It will be hard for you to see. Yeah, I mean, seriously, even this, you know, if you were in the darkest of dark situations in an event and you wanted to capture the moment, 51,200 ISO. I mean, it's losing detail. There's no doubt about it. We're having a hard time reading the 14 to 24, especially from the ZF. But, you know, the Nikon logo, the Dell logo, pretty good. Pepper's face, pretty good. I don't know. It's amazing. I'm flabbergasted. All right. So finally, we're going to do one more compare view, and that is of this Milky Way sky, captured with my favorite Milky Way lens on both cameras, the 21.8. Both of them the exact same exposure settings, 60 seconds, f8, 800 ISO on my Move Shoot Move Nomad Star Tracker, which I just did a video about. You want to know more about that, click right up here. But this is my favorite, by far, Milky Way lens I've ever used on a star tracker. It's sharp with hardly any coma or chromatic aberration all the way to the corners, and wide open at f1.8. And what I'm looking for here is noise at 800 ISO, and I'm just not seeing much of a difference between the two cameras. They're both phenomenal, phenomenal low light machines. And so that really leads me to, you know, where do I go with, I don't necessarily need both of these. I have a Z9 for action. I have a Z9 for advanced video, like the 120 frames per second. I don't really need 240 frames a second very much, and I just adore the aesthetics and the look of the ZF. So I think personally I'm going to keep my ZF. I like the way that the dials work, but I can lock them into control mode and still use it like a traditional or like a newer camera with the control wheels. And I like the slightly better dynamic range and low light performance. So it's not significant enough to throw either one out the door. They're very equivalent. I just personally love the retro styling, and I have a passionate feel for the ZF. It makes me happy to use it. So if anybody wants to buy my Z6III, it's you know, if I haven't already sold it, hit me up. I'll let you know. And I've got a bunch of cool accessories for it. So I'm going to be keeping the ZF. They're both wonderful cameras. Whichever one you own, you should be shooting and enjoying, and shoot it in low light at high ISO. Use it handheld with that in-body image stabilization. You're going to be astounded. All right, so that's my take on the Z6III, and kind of along the way the ZF. If you just got one of these cameras, you've been holding out for it, it's a real treat. These are both fantastic, fantastic new generation XPEED 7 processed cameras. I mean, it's a real jump from the older XPEED 6 cameras, the Z6, the Z7 variations before the 6.3, the Z50, all of those cameras. I think we're really moving into a new generation of incredibly capable machines. So while you're watching this, I'm off with an awesome workshop crew in David Archer and Rick LePage and Glacier National Park. Can't wait to bring you some stories from that. Make sure that you sign up. We're going to be doing an office hours when we get back. You can just click right here or run over to hudsonhenry.com/office hours and join us. We'll be taking your questions. You can leave us a question when you sign up. You can join us either on Zoom or YouTube Live. I hope all of you are staying safe, staying creative. Oh, one more thing. Remember, we've got links to all the gear that I've been talking about over at hudsonhenry.com/ATS links. You can click right here or just run into this video's full description and you can see links to all the gear that I use, recommend, and stand by. All right, everybody. So stay safe, stay creative, and we'll see you next week.